So thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar on parenting the anxious adolescent. As you'll see on the screen, this is a part one of a two-part course that's being delivered by the Under 18s Wellbeing Team as part of Norfolk and Suffolk NHS Foundation Trust. So what we're going to use during the webinar today is something called Slido to help us interact with you. It's a free interaction tool that you can access just by going to slido.com and then putting in this number 722175. Once you put that in, either on your web browser on your phone or on your computer, this question should come up. So we're just interested to see, how's your day been today? If 5 stars is perfect day, couldn't get any better, and 1 star is actually it's not been too great. And we've already got a few people coming in, which is amazing. So we're sort of on the upper end, which is good to see. And I'll just leave this one up for a moment just so that people have a chance to access Slido and to log in, because we're going to use it sort of throughout the webinar as our main way of interacting with you today. Excellent. So a little bit of variation there. Hopefully, if you put yourselves a bit of a lower rating, then maybe this webinar might make you feel a little bit better. But we'll see as we go through. So before we get cracking any further, I should probably introduce myself and my colleague. So my name's Ellis Blythe, and I'm an assistant psychologist within the Psychology in Schools team. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Gemma. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Gemma Dutton, and I'm a senior children's wellbeing practitioner working in the Under 18s Wellbeing Team.
Perfect. So Gemma and I are going to talk you through the webinar today, and we'll both be taking turns delivering different parts of it. So if you sort of hear Gemma's voice come out of nowhere, then that's fine. Don't panic. She's just doing her part, and then we'll swap it over.
I'll switch off now, and I'll rejoin you guys in the video in a little while.
Amazing. So the aims of the course, what we're trying to get out of the 2 parts that hopefully you'll be able to join us for, is really to give you some specific advice on managing anxiety. So this 2-part course is a follow-on from the Psychology in Schools team anxiety workshop that we deliver every month or so. And really this course is trying to build on that a bit more, to give you a little bit more and a little bit more specific information. So we're aiming to do this by helping parents, so you guys view yourselves as a coach and the resource to be part of the support network around your young person, to help support them to manage their own anxiety. We know that adolescents like to try and seek sort of independence compared to younger children. It's a completely normal part of their development. And we find that sort of parents taking the view as being a coach and helping them to manage their own mental well-being and anxiety can be a really helpful approach. We're going to be using Slido to help sort of facilitate some conversations and give some suggestions of actions that you might be able to take away and implement at home with your young person. And we also want you to help you feel supported by learning with other parents who are in a similar position. And that's going to be one of the helpful things about using Slido, is that you'll be able to see the views of other parents. And it's nice knowing that we're not alone in facing some of the difficulties that we might be facing. We know that anxiety in adolescence is a very common thing that crops up. So it'll be helpful, again, just to know that you're not going through this on your own. Okay. So before we get started with the main content, just a quick bit on confidentiality and safety. So like I say, during the webinar, we're going to be using Slido to ask you questions and get your feedback. Your responses will be visible on the screen to all the participants. So while it's anonymous, that your name won't be there, other people will be able to see what you write. So please don't share any personal details or confidential information, and just note that we won't be able to respond individually to sort of specific concerns, but we're trying to really address some common themes and give strategies that you can use rather than sort of a specific Q&A. So you'll notice that the Zoom, there's no chat function and there's no Q&A function in Slido. We're just using the main questions within Slido today to interact. And as we're doing this as a webinar, your cameras and mics won't work either. So don't worry about people seeing or hearing you. Okay, so what are you hoping to achieve from this course? What brings you here? What are you hoping to get out of coming to this two-part webinar by the Under 18s Wellbeing team? So I'll just give you all a moment to type some things out. Okay, so confidence in delivering this. So using confidence in using some of those strategies that we're going to be talking about a bit later. Understanding why my child is anxious. So once we start understanding, it becomes maybe a bit easier to try and support. It can be quite scary when these feelings sort of seem to come out of nowhere, or if we don't have that sort of understanding. Learning how to help my child. So we've got a specific worry about going to school. Learning how to help my child manage their emotions a bit better. It's quite a few themes around school coming up. So that sounds like that could be a bit of a tricky area for quite a few parents and young people at the moment. Okay, knowing what to say and how to talk about it, as well as sort of some strategies as well. How to live a better life is a really nice thing. So it's not just about reducing anxiety, but it's about helping our young people to get the most out of their lives, because we know that anxiety can really get in the way and can really be a hindrance to us sort of living our lives to the full. Okay, so feeling more confident as a parent as well. So having some more confidence in our own abilities and feeling more in the know, I suppose. Okay. And yeah, hopefully ways to help me manage my own anxiety as well to support my child. So these strategies that we're going to talk through, they're not just young person specific. Adults can use them and find them just as helpful. We're just coming at it from the view of a young person, but yeah, if you feel like you get anxious, like we all do, then hopefully some of the strategies that we talk about and some of the education that we're trying to give around anxiety might be quite helpful for you. Thank you very much for sharing those sort of goals, I suppose, of what you want to get out of this course. So some key areas for today. We're going to do a brief recap about what hopefully you would have learned from the Psychology in Schools webinar that you would have previously attended or have seen a recording of to have been able to come today. I know that for some people that might have been quite a while ago, so we're going to do a quick recap just to bring everyone back up to speed. We're going to talk a little bit about avoidance and sort of burying our heads in the sand like the ostrich there. We're going to think a little bit about creating a support network around our child and what that looks like. And we're going to have a little bit of a think about talking about our worries, or talking about worries with our young people. The first thing we're going to look at is the recap. This seems like a good place to start. And something that was covered in the Psychology in Schools workshop is something called the brain house, where we look at the brain and we sort of split it into two levels. It's quite a nice, simple way of trying to understand how the brain works when it comes to sort of emotions like anxiety and things like that. So we can split the brain into an upstairs and a downstairs. It resembles a house. So the upstairs represents our prefrontal cortex, which is the bit of the brain sort of just behind our forehead. And this is the part where all of our higher level thinking skills are. So this is where we sort of engage in planning. It might be our logical thinking, our rational thinking, all those sort of higher level thinking skills. And the downstairs part of the brain represents the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that includes things like the amygdala, and is sort of quite deep in the brain and quite down low towards the bottom. And this is something that is common between lots of animals. So it's something that we evolved with a long time ago. And as we've sort of developed as a species, we've grown this prefrontal cortex alongside sort of the limbic system. So that's sort of what separates us a little bit from animals as well, the fact that we can access these higher level thinking skills. We don't just mainly rely on this limbic system. So what happens is that the prefrontal cortex, we often say that that's where all the thinkers live. And the downstairs part of the brain, the limbic system, that's where all the feelers live. So that's the floor that's quite emotion focused. It tries to keep us safe. It deals with sort of the fight, flight, and freeze response that we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. but really this part of the brain is just trying to keep us safe from dangers that we think are around us. Now, if you notice the picture on the left, there's a staircase that joins the upstairs and the downstairs parts of the brain. And this is when our brain works the best, when both parts can communicate with each other. So the downstairs, the feelers might see something that they think is dangerous, ring that alarm bell and start to get a bit worried, a bit anxious. But the upstairs part of the brain might someone might come downstairs and say, you know what, actually, we don't need to be worried about that. It's safe. We've seen this before, and they can talk with each other. And that's key, really, the fact that they can communicate. If we're feeling quite anxious or overwhelmed, we can do something called flipping our lid. So the upstairs part of the brain flips off. It doesn't do that physically. Our brain is very much intact. But for the sake of the example, the upstairs part of the brain flips off. All those thinkers sort of fall over, and they can't get down the stairs to talk to the feelers anymore. And what happens then is that the downstairs part of the brain is in the driving seat. We're being driven by our emotions and by our desire to try and keep safe. And we know that teenagers often rely more on the downstairs part of the brain because of how the brain develops during adolescence as well. So the brain's being pruned, where all these unused connections are sort of being severed so that it becomes a bit more streamlined, like if you're pruning a rose bush. But this happens from the back to the front. So the front part of the brain, where we do our logical and rational thinking and our planning, is the last bit to sort of be fully developed in adolescence. So when we're feeling quite anxious and overwhelmed, we can think about us flipping our lids, and we can think about the downstairs part of the brain being in the driving seat, trying to keep us safe and being really emotionally driven. And we're going to sort of keep referring to that as we go through the rest of this webinar. Okay, so a Slido question for you, if that's okay. What anxious thoughts and physical sensations does your young person report when they feel anxious? So what sort of thoughts do you notice crop into their heads? What do they tell you crop into their heads? We're not mind readers. And what physical sensations do you notice that they experience when your young person's feeling anxious? Okay, so feel like they're going to be sick. That's a really common one. So that's like the butterflies in the tummy. And that can, be accompanied by tummy aches as well. So those are some sort of really quite physical feelings going on. Similar with the headaches or that physical feeling. Worried about what others think, or thinking that something bad might happen to them or us. So some of these worried thoughts are starting to come through now. So, thinking that other people are going to judge them, or starting to think the worst might happen. Your young person might get a bit quiet, and that's quite common as well, sort of being a little bit reserved, thinking everything will go wrong, thinking they can't cope. I can't do this, I won't do this. So these are really common thoughts that we have with anxiety, and I'm sure as you're seeing these crop up yourself, you're thinking, actually, when I feel anxious, I experience some of these things as well. But they can still be scary, and they can still be unusual for our young people, especially if they're not used to these sort of thoughts and feelings coming in, and if they don't know how to manage them, it can be even more concerning. So faster breathing, that increased breathing rate, thoughts running through the mind, so trying to make sense of them but finding that quite difficult, and we can sort of get stuck on those thoughts as they spin around. So if you can't do something bad will happen. So so that's sort of predicting the future or thinking about the worst, feeling sick. Wonderful, we're getting so many comments. This is really, really good. So feeling wobbly all over, so sort of feeling a bit shaky, or freezing, so won't move or speak. So that comes under sort of that fight, flight, and freeze response, where we might freeze in the face of danger or perceived danger. Okay, so won't listen to me, and that's something that's really common with anxiety as well, especially if we think about flipping our lids, sort of being able to talk things through rationally is sort of an upstairs part of the brain job. If the lid's being flipped, the downstairs part of the brain doesn't really want to do that. It just wants to try and get safe, and sort of act in the moment to try and feel a bit safer. Okay, amazing. So I'm going to move on from this one, but thank you very much for your comments. Needing reassurance just before I move on is something we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I'm glad someone's mentioned that. So I don't really need to talk through the slide very much because you've all summed it up so well in the Slido. But these things on the screen at the moment are sort of some of those physical feelings that we can experience with anxiety. So they're all very, very common when we feel worried, and they all link into what's happening in the body when we're experiencing this anxiety, and they link into that fight, flight, and freeze response. So if we think about back in caveman times, anxiety is the thing that would keep us safe, because it would start pumping some adrenaline around our body to get us ready to fight something that's dangerous to us, or to run away from it, or in some cases we might freeze. So the heart pounding and the quicker breathing, that's all to get more blood and oxygen pumping around our body and to get that adrenaline moving around to our muscles. The feeling sick, often we don't need a lot of blood and oxygen in our tummy to digest the burger we've just eaten if we're trying to run away from a predator. Instead, we need that blood and oxygen going elsewhere, so that can leave us feeling a bit sick. And the same thing with the trembling, that might sort of be a response to some of that adrenaline pumping around. So all these physical responses that you've mentioned are really quite common, and they link in with what anxiety is trying to do to our body in order to keep us safe. You also mentioned a lot of different anxious thinking. And again, really, really common part of anxiety is the way that we think and the way that we perceive situations. So the picture on the left there shows some of the common thinking traps that our adolescents can get caught in, and even us as adults can get caught in them. I find myself getting caught in them as well. So just to take a few of these, mind reading, for instance, we think that we know what other people are thinking. So sometimes being worried about being judged, we might start thinking as if we know what the other person is believing about us. Catastrophizing, so thinking the worst is going to happen, and really blowing that worrying situation sometimes out of proportion. Anxiety likes us to be prepared for danger, and likes us to think the worst so that the body can be prepared, but that's often not helpful at all, really. And we can often focus on the negatives. This is something that is also more common in teenagers as well. So it's helpful to be mindful of some of the physical feelings and some of the anxious thinking that our teenagers can get caught in, because it just helps us to understand some of that anxiety a bit better. And sometimes understanding that anxiety can help us to feel a bit more comfortable with it being there at times, because it doesn't feel so scary if we know what it is. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Gemma, who's going to talk us through the next bit.
Great, thanks, Alice. So I'm just going to talk about the cycle of avoidance. And some of you kind of already said that you notice kind of when your young person is feeling really anxious, they kind of don't want to do things, or they kind of hold themselves back from doing things. And avoidance is really, really common when people feel anxious. And if you think about what Alice was saying about anxiety is kind of a safety mechanism, it's trying to keep us safe. It's so natural that if something makes us feel anxious, we want to get away from it, and we want to stop doing it or avoid it, or find sometimes really long and convoluted ways around it. And anxiety is a really effective strategy in the short term for managing your anxiety, because you feel a bit anxious, you don't do it, and then your anxiety kind of goes down. But over time, when you keep kind of repeating that, in the long term, it can become really unhelpful, because it sort of starts reinforcing a message that you can't cope with a situation, or you start to feel even more afraid of it the more you avoid something, because you never really know what's going to happen or how you would cope with it. And so actually, although to start with in the short term, avoidance kind of might feel like it's reducing your anxiety, in the long term, we know it really keeps anxiety going, and it's one of the key things that kind of maintains that anxiety. And it's so easy and so common for people to kind of get in a cycle of avoidance, as we can see on the screen, where we just kind of stop doing things, and then it feels even harder to think about how we might approach them or do them. We're going to talk a bit about also the fact that it's quite a high cost strategy. It's not always helpful to avoid things. Some of you were commenting on, your young people feeling really anxious about school. And I think that's such a good example of, it's actually really difficult to avoid school, something we have to do. So anxiety and avoidance kind of go a bit hand in hand, but they don't always sit well together. So we're going to talk about how we can kind of think about that avoidance cycle. I think we're going to move on now to a Slido. And I just wanted to get you guys to kind of think about and share situations that you've noticed your young person is avoiding when they're anxious. Things that, you know, maybe they've stopped doing, or things that you think they'd like to do, but maybe they are avoiding. So school has come up, and that's a really common one. I'm not surprised that's kind of the first one, especially after kind of COVID and lockdowns, people being out of the school routine. We've also got seeing friends and meeting up with friends and family. And I think kind of social situations kind of being a bit unpredictable sometimes, or we had people sharing earlier worries about judgment or what other people might be thinking. So then people just kind of stop going out or seeing their friends, and that can really impact their sort of quality of life. We've got not talking to people, staying in your room. So yeah, just like withdrawing is sometimes what parents will really commonly see. They don't see all the little things someone's avoiding, but they just see that they're just staying in their room, they're just staying where they feel kind of comfortable. We've got crowded places, another really common one. If there's lots of people, lots of things going on. Got going out to eat as well. Sometimes people feel really self-conscious eating in front of other people, or worried about ordering in restaurants or things like that. So those kind of social interactions. Got school work, big gatherings, and speaking to adults. I think that really nicely sums up a lot of the common themes of things that people worry about when they're anxious about going to school, because there's the kind of people side of it, there's the social interaction, talking to the teachers, asking for help, and anything social, or people being on their own anywhere. Yeah, I think sometimes what we see is people might go to things, but they always go with a friend, or they always want a parent to go with them or to stay with them. So it might seem like they're not avoiding because they're doing that thing, but they're always needing to do it with someone else. So they're kind of avoiding doing it on their own, which is still a kind of avoidance. And it's good to point out that avoidance can be a bit kind of tricky to see like that. So we've also got public transport, toilets. Yeah, lots of people actually, it's really, really common, feel sort of embarrassed or anxious about going to the toilet at school or in public places. They kind of avoid it, which is obviously really uncomfortable for them. Someone saying they get quite angry, which I think, yeah, avoidance is actually so frustrating, isn't it? Especially if you want to do something, but you feel like you can't, or you're feeling that pressure to do something and thinking, I just can't do that, I feel too anxious. Not looking at others or talking to others. We've got one more person typing, so I'll just wait for that one, and then we'll move on. But these are all just really fantastic ideas, and obviously great things that you've observed, that you're noticing, that avoidance can affect so many different situations and come up in lots of different ways. And hopefully seeing these themes as well, there are some similarities that people are writing in, so you're definitely not alone. There's lots of people noticing similar things. Yeah, someone saying social situations. So, and it's really broad, isn't it? That kind of avoidance, you could just start to see how that would really affect someone if they're feeling like they need to avoid all social situations. Their life kind of could become quite small. So yeah, great suggestions. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to move on now to another Slido. And I think I just want to kind of offer you guys as parents the chance to think about how you maybe get drawn into your young person's avoidance, because I think avoidance is a really natural response to anxiety, and it's really natural for parents to kind of, when you're seeing your young person, you know, anxious, I think a good example is school, and they're really uncomfortable and they've got all those physical symptoms Ellis was talking about, and they just kind of want to stay at home and they're so distressed. You know, it's so normal that we as parents, you know, you want to alleviate that distress. So just kind of want to think about that and really normalize that is completely a normal and natural response that all parents, everybody would do. So we've got someone saying doing things for them. Yeah, and I think sometimes also we do that because we anticipate, oh, I don't want them to be really upset, I want them to have a good day. Maybe it's just a bit quicker or easier if I do that. Someone saying doing lots of reassurance, and we're definitely going to come back to that. So thank you for mentioning that. You're not alone in that. Someone saying they get angry, their young person gets angry when they're anxious. They don't want to have an argument, so they let them stay at home. I think that's a really good example of sometimes we just want to like pick our fights, or we don't always have time to have that argument in the morning, and we don't want our young people to be really distressed going to school. Someone saying always being with them when they're out, ordering food for them and texting them. I think that's a really good point someone's raised. You know, sometimes you might be there even when you're not there, kind of either on the phone or texting, just to kind of give that reassurance, or they might be seeking the reassurance from you saying, this is happening, is this okay? And someone saying doing things they should be able to do, which is a really hard one when you think about like the teenage years and kind of teenagers gradually getting a lot more independent. So sometimes it's really easy to not notice that may be happening because it's something that you've kind of always done, and then maybe they just still need that support, or they don't want to kind of maybe take that step. So got someone that I missed here saying it's tough, but I just want to stop her having a panic attack if she's out. Yeah, I think that's so understandable. It's so frightening when we see someone kind of having an anxiety attack and all those physical symptoms. It's frightening for them, and it's frightening for us to kind of see that as well. So of course we want to sort of step in and stop that happening. I think it's really important to remember what Ellis said there, that, you know, those physical symptoms aren't harmful, but they are really uncomfortable. But it's so difficult to kind of hold that in mind when you're seeing it. And we've got someone else saying, letting them have the time off school, it's not worth the distress or the fights. And yeah, I think that's a real kind of pragmatic decision that sometimes parents are facing every day. Like, is it worth the distress? Are we going to get so distressed that when we get to school, oh, is anything going to go in? Are we going to learn anything? So avoidance, I think all of these responses just show how it's really natural to get drawn into that cycle, and it can make kind of dealing with that anxiety, you know, really, it's really challenging for everyone. So hopefully everyone feels, you know, can see from other people's responses that it's just a normal cycle we get pulled into as parents, and kind of being aware of that is just really important and really helpful. So I think we'll move on now to think about something that kind of follows on from that. And I guess it's just thinking about, you know, if avoidance is so kind of natural and instinctive, and it's so easy to get pulled into, and we're all, you know, we're kind of susceptible to that. How do we start challenging it? Like, where do you begin? And I think, you know, the first step in challenging avoidance is to just notice that it's happening, because you all did such a great job on that slide of just thinking about the situations where it's happening, what you might be doing. And we've kind of got a bit of a table on the slide, and sometimes just thinking, how is your adolescent avoiding things? Are the behaviors really subtle? You know, are they things like they're going to stuff, but they're always going with a friend, or they're always, you know, they might get the bus, but they're always texting you for the whole journey just to check everything's kind of okay? Or are they more obvious things, like they just can't do certain things, like someone said, not going to a dance class or not going out, you know, they've really withdrawn in their room. So just kind of want you to start thinking about and noticing over the next few weeks with your adolescent, like, what are the behaviors which maybe have become kind of normal to them, but actually when you step back and think about it, they might kind of be avoiding that situation. So it might be like someone said, they never go out with their friends and it's just kind of become normal, or they never order food at the restaurant because as parents we're so good at anticipating what they want or what they might have that we just kind of jump in and do it for them. I think the idea behind this is just, it's really important to think about the motivation, about why your teen or adolescent isn't doing something. Is it because they just don't want to go out and that's completely fine? Or is it because they really want to go out with their friends, but they just feel so anxious that actually they can't, and so they're kind of avoiding and holding themselves back? So I think it's just thinking, you know, with the table as well, some questions there for you to maybe pose and take home, so you can think about how you might start talking about avoidance with your young person. So we're going to move on to another Slido now, getting you to think about how your young person avoids. So not just what they avoid, which is kind of what we talked about before, but how do they do it? What are the kind of telltale signs that you could kind of look out for? So we might have things like someone said earlier, you know, they might go to the restaurant, so they're physically there with you, but they don't order any food, for example. Yeah, someone's saying that they feel, so the young person says they're feeling unwell. So yeah, and that gets a really normal response of like, oh, okay, well, maybe stay home then, or don't go to school, or, and we know they are having those physical kind of symptoms as well. So it's quite confusing maybe for them. Got some more people typing, so we'll see. And I think it's helpful as well as parents to see the other signs that other parents are picking up on as well. So we've got someone saying that they become really upset. So like emotionally, they become really distressed. And then of course it's natural, they're upset, they're maybe crying, they don't want to go out, or it doesn't feel like, you know, the right thing for them, refusing to sit with their friends at lunch, so they just kind of stay by themselves. I think that kind of isolating is really, really common. Avoiding talking about how they're feeling. Yeah, I think that's part of avoidance as well, isn't it? These feelings of anxiety are so uncomfortable that we just don't want sometimes to even acknowledge that we're having them, or we don't know how to say that that's what's going on for us. It's easier to just say nothing, or it feels too much to even start talking about. So that's a really, really good one that someone shared. Arguing, yeah. Someone said you just have that fight every day before school, that argument to avoid. Refusing to talk about why they're worried, so I can't help. Don't, these are coming so fast, I'm missing them, but I think that one is also really important. Parents so often want to help and want to talk about worries and what's going on, but the young person just really struggling. Someone says the young person doesn't speak, so you as a parent have to kind of step in because it kind of gets a bit embarrassing. So yeah, just waiting for someone else to kind of take over. Someone's saying they use distractions, they become angry, start shouting, or they just stay in, hiding in the room. So yeah, just like really withdrawing in. I think someone also said kind of living in a virtual world below, which was a really interesting comment. Just kind of thinking about, you know, how normal it is for kind of teenagers to kind of live a lot of their lives online now. But is that a choice, or is that because that feels safer than kind of going out and socializing, you know, face to face with people? Someone's put self-harming, and I think, you know, that's a really important thing to acknowledge, because we want to be really mindful of our young people being safe and how they're kind of managing their feelings. And sometimes when we get like a real build-up of anxiety, and people have said it's really hard to talk about, people might manifest that pain and that distress physically. So it's really important to kind of look out for some of those signs and talk to your young person about that. And if necessary, kind of talk to your GP or get extra advice on that. But yeah, it's a really important sign to look out for. And often people feel a lot of shame about self-harming. So I think as a parent, just kind of taking that non-judgmental approach of just being open to have the conversation if you feel able to, is just really important. We've kind of ended on a brilliant comment of someone saying avoiding being under the spotlight. And I think that's so good, because often avoidance goes from situation to situation, but any way that the young person maybe can just avoid not being in the center of attention, they might be there, but they might be kind of holding themselves back. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's also a really good one. Okay, we're going to move on, because I'm sure as parents, one of the things that you really want to know is like, okay, I'm noticing the avoidance and I'm noticing how I'm getting drawn into it, and I've got the sort of telltale signs now. What do I do with it? You know, that's what I'd be thinking. How do I start challenging this avoidance? I think it's helpful, and I guess I want to suggest this as sort of a conversation. So conversation starters or ideas that you can kind of take away and have in your own way with your young person. But I think where I often start when I talk to young people is I think about the cost of it. Like, what is it costing you to avoid all these things? What are you missing out on? Like, what really matters to you? And what are you not doing because you're feeling like you're not able to do it, or you need to avoid it because you feel so anxious? And I think when, you know, you talk to young people about what they're missing out on, they're often things they really want to do. Like they want to be able to go out with their friends, or they want to have that independence to go and order their own food in a restaurant, or use public transport so they can go and see their friends, but they're not feeling able to. So that thinking about the cost of avoidance can be a really nice way into that conversation. And we've got on the screen some kind of values cards, and sometimes they can be a really helpful kind of conversation starter, and we will email these out to people as well, so you've got them as a resource. Just thinking about what your young person values and what kind of a life they want to live, and what kind of an identity they're really trying to develop as a teen. So we've got one like having autonomy. You know, if you're someone that really values independence, you may really want to be able to do those things for yourself, but avoidance is kind of holding you back. And I think as parents, this can be a really nice way to kind of get to know what is going to motivate your young person to help them kind of challenge that avoidance. Because you can start to see what they would want to be able to do differently. And I think that's a question I always kind of drop into conversations as well when I'm talking to teenagers. I always say, like, what would be different? What would you be doing if you weren't avoiding things? What would life look like? What would you kind of be able to do? And I think that's a really good way to kind of pinpoint where avoidance is becoming problematic, and then you sort of know where to start. So I think, and it's really important when you're kind of talking about how to challenge that avoidance, to kind of think about, just normalizing that we all do it. We all avoid things we don't want to do if we're nervous about them. And it can be a tricky conversation for you as parents to have. So, you don't need to have the kind of whole conversation as once, but just starting to think about what your young person might want to be doing if avoidance wasn't kind of holding them back from that is a really good place to start. So I think we're going to just go to another slide here now, just to kind of help this sink in a little bit. Think about maybe a time when you guys as parents have kind of used your values to motivate you to overcome something that you were afraid of. And I think a really natural example that kind of comes to mind for me is like thinking about maybe something like, being afraid of flying, but you really want to go on holiday. So like you've got a really high incentive, really motivated. Maybe you're, really motivated by travel or adventure or exploring new places, or, you're really interested in kind of going overseas or culture or things like that, but you're really afraid of flying. So you're kind of using that motivation to think about, what would I want to be able to do? What's the thing you need to be able to not avoid in order to do that? So I think I've got a few people typing in. I'll just see what comes through. But I think also it's important to say, it can really help our young people when we share with them, kind of appropriate examples of when we've experienced that dilemma ourselves, the dilemma of, I really wish I could do that, but I end up avoiding it because I feel, I feel anxious when I do it. So sharing these examples can be a great thing to kind of incorporate in your conversation. When you're talking to a young person about avoidance. Someone said, they overcome everyday anxiety for my children. I try to manage it and act confident for the sake of my children. Yeah, I think that's such a good example. Someone saying, actually they feel anxiety every day. And I think, having children puts so many new situations and things you've got to confront as an adult, but they're just trying to show that confidence, which is really important. Someone saying starting college course, yeah, all those new feelings of starting a new course, but you probably really value, that personal development. So again, that's kind of a value that motivates you. Someone saying, oh, I can't read it now, I value being healthy, and they want to join a gym. So I guess starting to kind of put themselves out there, go out of the comfort zone that they're in, to kind of hold that value of being healthy. And of course, lots of people in gyms, so I can't see the rest of their comment, but I think, that's a really good example of going into a new situation or a new area, but really valuing health. So wanting to kind of put yourself out there. Someone saying, spiders, I don't want my child to be scared of them. So I tried to pretend I wasn't. And if I couldn't, I'd get my husband to remove it. That's a really, really great idea. So yeah, sometimes, if we kind of fake it a little bit, like that we're not afraid, but then also if we really are, then maybe we just switch out as a parent and get someone else to kind of help with that. Someone saying changing jobs, trying something new. So yeah, maybe your value is like your career or your development, and to get that progress, you've got to kind of try something new, and it's always really scary starting a new job as well. Someone saying overcoming anxiety talking on the phone, you needed to get a job. That's a brilliant example, like really important for most jobs to kind of communicate, and so you had to kind of push through that. Having a new job and presenting, yeah, I definitely feel you on that one. Presenting can be quite challenging, can't it? Kind of putting yourself out there, people are seeing you, but it's part of your job. So yeah, using your value of maybe wanting to do well at work, or being conscientious to learn that new skill. Someone's written in a comment here, so I just want to take a moment to read it. They've said, I value helping others, but sometimes at my own detriment. So in order to take care of others as best I can, I make sure I do things to take care of myself too, recharge my batteries and show my child this is important. I just think that's absolutely lovely. Yeah, I think that's really important. And And so many times we're kind of thinking about caring for others, but we need to think about who's caring for us, and just kind of permit ourselves to care for ourselves and give ourselves that time, whatever it is that you need to do. So I think that takes us really, really nicely onto the next slide, actually. So thank you for that. I think it's so important, just like that last comment kind of showed us, that we need to acknowledge like support for parents and for our young people is so important when we're managing anxiety. And I think it's kind of a well-known saying, isn't it? Like, it takes a village to raise a child. But it's kind of true, you know, really, when you think about all the people in your child's life that are having an impact on them, it really is a whole network of people. And I think, you know, a really good example of that is COVID, and how when we were kind of cut off from some of our networks and support systems, a lot of people found that really difficult. And of course, that's a really natural response to not having that wider support network in our lives. And I think especially for teenagers, it's important to acknowledge that they are seeking that kind of independent or like external influences. Definitely kind of developmentally around sort of 15, 16, becomes so normal for them to kind of be more influenced by other people in their lives than kind of their parents and their family, because they're trying to figure out who they are, and they you know, they're getting lots of reference points and influences, especially as their kind of social network becomes really important. So I think it's just important to think about who is in your support network and who's in your young person's support network. And just like that last person shared, you know, it's really important to think about what helps us recharge and feel able. And also, someone else shared, you know, if something's really difficult for you as a parent to manage, like the spiders, who can step in and kind of help you with that? So, you know, just like you've got a wide range of support, hopefully as an adult, of friends and colleagues and your manager or your family, or maybe certain groups that you go to, we also want to think about who is that support network for your young person. Because we know that when we've got that wider support network, it's so positive for our emotional well-being. And so sometimes that's a really important part of helping a young person manage their anxiety, is letting them know where are the places that they can go and have support and feel confident, have their confidence lifted, and places that they're going to feel comfortable. So I think we're going to move on to just think about this a little bit more. For young people, I guess it's just important to acknowledge that those support networks can come in all different kind of places. So we've got some kind of clubs that you might know, like guides or scouts, but we've also got sports coaches, and we've got kind of religious groups that people might be affiliated to. Lots of young people start doing things like volunteering, or they do like Duke of Edinburgh type awards where they come into contact with volunteering for the first time. And we've got also kind of like professional organisations like Kooth, a sort of free kind of counselling service that's online and anonymous for young people. And also we've just got a group of friends, because I think your friends are so influential, you know, especially when you're in your teenage years. So just want to kind of emphasise that, you know, it's not all on you as parents. There are support networks out there for your young person, and it's really important to help think about how they can engage in those networks and the different types of support that they might provide. And I think it's really common, you know, sometimes I hear from parents, they say like, oh, if I say it, they won't, you know, if I say this to my young person, maybe they won't hear it. But if their like sports coach does, or their teacher or their friend, then they kind of hear it a lot more. So that's just something really important to think about. And I think if we move on to the next slide, I just want to give you guys the opportunity to think about who might be in yours and your child's support network, both of you, like who have you got to kind of draw on, who might be able to provide some of that support, so that you don't kind of feel that pressure of being on your own to kind of help your young person manage their anxiety. Someone saying grandparents, yeah, that's often a really lovely relationship and a really important relationship, actually, that kind of being one step removed, but maybe sharing some family values as well can help. Someone saying church, yeah, lots of church groups can become really important for young people, a sort of sense of guidance as well. Got teachers, friends, family, yeah, and I think all of us can probably think about, you know, influential teachers for good and for bad, but often people say I've got that one teacher and they believed in me, or they kind of pushed me along. Someone saying close friends. Someone saying they wish they could say they were supportive, but they feel their young person doesn't listen. And that sounds really, really difficult. And I think that kind of goes maybe a little bit to what Ellis was saying earlier about, can they listen? If they're in that sort of, if they've kind of flipped their lid and they're really distressed, maybe they just can't hear what you want to say, but maybe there are other ways that they know that you're supportive. I'm sure there are. Someone saying their sister, and yeah, siblings are a great kind of middle ground between parents. If you've got older siblings, sometimes they can give a bit of advice or guidance from their more kind of experience. Someone saying they've got a great youth worker, which is brilliant. Online communities as well. I just saw someone type. Pets and the dog, definitely. I think animals can be such a great source of relief, because you can talk to them, but they don't talk back. And sometimes people find that really soothing. Or you can get out for a walk with the dog, and that just helps you to really calm things down. Someone saying mainly me. So I think that means mainly like the parent they talk to. And that's great if you've got that really close bond that you can kind of share things with. Someone saying they used to have a great support, but now they've withdrawn. Only me now. So that might be something that, as a parent, you kind of think, how can I use my connection with them to help them kind of get back towards their engaging with their support network? And someone saying artwork and reading books. And I think, yeah, that's also really, really helpful. That sometimes your support is maybe an activity or your artwork expressing how you feel. So loads of great ideas. And hopefully, you've all seen something on there as well that maybe you hadn't thought of, or you can kind of take away and think about with your young person as well. So just one last kind of question to reflect on before I kind of hand back over to Ellis. But just want to think about, as a parent, how do you feel seeing the different types of support that your adolescent might be accessing? Because I think sometimes, for some of you, you've said you feel like it's just you, and it's just you that they can kind of talk to. But for others of you, you've kind of pinpointed different groups that your teenager or adolescent is kind of engaged in. And I wonder, how does that feel? I think, yeah, there's so many different feelings that could come from this, and there's no right or wrong answer. I think some people, someone's saying they feel really grateful, and sometimes parents feel really relieved. There's like a wider network of support out there, and it's not just sitting with them. And sometimes parents can feel quite kind of rejected, because they feel like, I really want my young person to talk to me, but I know they just talk to their friends online, and I really want to be part of the conversation. And so I think that's really normal. Yeah, someone's saying they feel a bit left out. Is it okay to say jealous? Yeah, it's okay to say whatever you feel. Whatever you feel is the right answer for you. And I think that's really important to say. Someone's saying it feels hard that they might want to speak to someone online rather than me. Someone's saying they feel quite hopeful. Someone is saying happy when it's good support, worried when it's their so-called friends and they don't support them in the right way. And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? It's also about kind of stepping back as a parent, acknowledging we don't have so much control. Like when they're at primary school and we know all their friends and the parents of the friends, and at high school, it just doesn't work in the same way. And I think that can feel really frightening as a parent. Someone's saying they're feeling quite lonely because they don't have that much of a support network, unfortunately. And I really appreciate that person kind of taking the risk to share that with us as a group, because it might be that it's good that we've come up with some ideas of places that you could get some more support, places you could look for it. And I think it's important to say it's always really frightening stepping into a new group, taking that risk of, but there can be some really helpful groups out there. Someone saying, I worry that I won't know what they're doing, but thankful for the help. So kind of maybe worrying, that they don't know what their teen is doing, but they're just glad they're talking to someone or they have some support. And someone saying in reality the support isn't there most of the time. And I think, yeah, that's also true, isn't it? Sometimes we feel like we want a certain type of help, but it's not there, or it's hard for a young person to access. So I guess I just wanted to highlight that, it gets more complicated as you become a teenager. Your support network gets broader and wider, and that can have really good feelings, but also, as some people have shared, sometimes some quite difficult feelings. And that's something that you're kind of holding as parents. But hopefully you've seen some, different types of support, and seen where your young person can be supported, and that could give you some helpful ideas. I'm going to hand back now to Ellis, I think, and give you a break from the sound of my voice, but I'll join you all again in a little while.
Thanks, Gemma. That's great. So we've spoken a bit about avoidance. Gemma's gone through as well about sort of thinking about the wider support network and what that might look like for your young person. And I thought it would be helpful just to touch on a bit about reassurance as well. I know that someone mentioned earlier in the slider that when the young person's feeling anxious, they seek a lot of reassurance. And reassurance is really, it's a completely normal response for a parent. It's a really common thing that we all engage in, not just as a parent, but if we've got a friend or friend or a loved one that's feeling anxious, we can often offer reassurance as well. For us as a parent or the person doing the supporting, it can be a really quick way of trying to provide some sort of relief from those uncomfortable feelings. And similarly for our young people, it's a quick way of them sort of feeling that relief. But unfortunately, it follows in a similar pattern to avoidance. So while we get that short-term relief with reassurance, in the long term, it actually sort of helps that anxiety to grow a bit more, because it can sort of reaffirm that our young people can't cope on their own. It sort of falls into this cycle of needing reassurance to know that something's going to be safe. So if we think about the brain house, and if we think about flipping our lids, we're sort of being driven by those emotions, being driven by the need to try and keep safe. Our young people aren't accessing that logical thinking to sort of think about the event or the situation in a logical or rational way. Instead, it's quick and easy to ask for reassurance and for their parents, for you guys to sort of be their upstairs part of their brain and to sort of say, yeah, you know what, it's going to be okay. The issue with this is that, like I say, it reaffirms they can't cope on their own. So it sometimes can lead young people to sort of perceive that actually that situation could be dangerous. If mum or dad is telling me that, yeah, that'll be fine, like it almost reaffirms that, there could be some danger there. And it often leads for further reassurance to be sought in the future. Similar to avoidance, it sort of becomes a default way of responding to those anxious feelings that we get. So rather than the young person sort of thinking for themselves and trying to reassure themselves and cope in that situation, they're looking for the external support to say, is this going to be okay? And there's a time and place for reassurance, right? I'm not saying it's an awful thing, you should never do it. Life isn't always conducive to be able to do other things, and reassurance forms a natural part of us trying to comfort our young people. But I think it's helpful to be mindful that offering that reassurance repeatedly can have a negative impact similar to avoidance. So we need to be mindful of our young people asking these sort of what if questions. And I know sort of a lot of young people go through this where they'll seek reassurance. And we need to be mindful of not just necessarily giving direct reassurance, but also sort of that indirect reassurance. So preempting worries, a bit like Gemma mentioned earlier with avoidance and ordering our young people's food for them, if that's their worry. We're sort of preempting that this response is going to come up and we're acting in advance of it. Similarly with doing lots of planning as well. It's sort of a reassurance that isn't just saying, yeah, things are going to be okay, don't worry about that. But it's a really common response that we have. So I'm kind of interested really, how often do you notice yourself reassuring your young people? And like I say, it's a completely normal response. It comes out of a position of love, wanting to take away that distress from our young people. And everyone engages in it, but we engage in it at different levels. So I'm just wondering where you think you fit on the scale that we've put on the screen there for you. Okay, so the people that have responded so far, it's more often than not, it's either once or more a day. We haven't got anyone that sort of goes a few days without offering reassurance. And the majority is that, you're offering that reassurance a few times a day. And I think that sort of demonstrates that sort of no matter how many times you offer reassurance, you kind of need to keep doing it again and again and again. It sort of creates a bit of a trap where our young people feel like they need that reassurance in order to cope with the situation or in order to know that it's going to be safe. And actually what we kind of need to do is try to develop a different strategy to help our young people to challenge that anxiety and to feel more confident in their ability to challenge that on their own. And we'll come to that in a minute. So thank you for answering that scale. And I guess just another quick Slido question for you is, why do you provide reassurance? And I'd really like it if you can feel like you can be honest here, because we do it for lots of different reasons. I know for me, I often fall into the trap of providing reassurance because it's quick. Like if you've got your young person who's anxious about going to school and they mention it just as you pull up to the school gate, you don't want to be sitting there having a really long conversation. You've got to get to work. Like life gets in the way sometimes. So there's lots of different motivations. So someone there said it's quick. I don't know what else to say or do. Yeah, and reassurance comes very naturally to us. It's something that we do sort of instinctively almost. So we can learn different ways of helping our young people to manage. So I don't know what else to do. Child keeps asking and trying to calm them down when they're asking a lot, and that can be really tricky as well. Again, reassurance comes out of a position of love and care, right? We're trying to take away those uncomfortable feelings, and reassurance is a really quick way of doing that in the moment. But similar to avoidance, in the long term, it means they keep asking for reassurance, which means that we have to keep offering it, and it sort of goes around in a cycle. So to get out the door in the morning, absolutely. No ideas, it makes no difference, but I still do it. So even though you're seeing that it's not really doing too much, it's still something we do. And I wonder if part of that is it makes us feel better because it makes us feel like we're doing something if we're not too sure what else to do. So it makes me anxious. And I wonder if that anxiety is because your young person's anxious, or providing the reassurance makes you anxious. Just wondering what you mean by that, if that's okay. To show that I care, yeah, to sort of show that love. If not, my boy gets cross with me, it's easier to say it's going to be okay. So we know that anxiety can often sort of come through as different emotions. So frustration and anger are really common ones for young people when they're feeling anxious. And if your young person isn't getting that reassurance, isn't getting that immediate relief that reassurance provides, then that frustration, yeah, can build, and it's scary. And through desperation, I'm really hoping that some of the strategies that we're going to talk about in part 2, and also towards the end of this webinar about building self-assurance, can hopefully try and help with helping you to feel a bit more confident in supporting your young person, because it can be really, really difficult parenting our child when they are really anxious. Okay, thank you very much for being so honest. I know it's quite difficult, but it's amazing to sort of have a really almost blunt conversation about it, and it's okay because we all do this for different reasons, and sometimes life gets in the way. Reassurance is a nice quick way of trying to relieve that distress, and sometimes that's all we can do in the moment. So the alternative to reassurance is self-assurance, and really what self-assurance is trying to do is trying to build the ability in our young people to be able to reassure themselves. So rather than coming to you to say, is it going to be okay? The goal is hope that they'll be able to ask themselves that question and to use evidence or to start challenging that worry to be able to manage those feelings themselves. Now, before we think about this anymore, I think it's important to mention 2 things. If your young person's feeling particularly anxious, trying to go through self-assurance is going to be really tricky because they're most likely flip their lid. They can't access that logical, more rational thinking to be able to start challenging that worry. So what we might need to do is help them cope in the moment, use some strategies to help them regulate and calm down before they start engaging in the self-assurance. And sort of coping in the moment is something that we'll talk a bit more about in part 2, I believe. So it's just being mindful that we may need our young people to calm down a bit, and for that lid to come down before they can start doing some of this more higher level thinking in challenging that anxiety. And the second point that's important to remember as part of self-assurance is that as parents, we might need to guide our young people through this process quite a bit before they start to get it and feel confident in using it themselves. And if we're guiding them through it, it's always best to sort of validate those emotions and those feelings before we start to challenge them. So come alongside, really build that connection and say, you know what, yeah, I get why you're feeling worried. Thanks for explaining that. It's okay to feel to feel anxious. It's a really tricky emotion to feel, but you're safe in feeling that sort of with me, and just provide them with that safe space to experience that anxiety. And I know that can be really, really difficult, especially if your young person is sort of almost having an anxiety attack or is really frustrated. So that can take a bit of time, and they might need a bit of regulation before they can get to that point of just experiencing it in a safe way. So once your young person's a little bit calmer and able to engage in this thinking, we might want them to ask themselves, or we might want to ask the questions as well that are on the screen. So trying to get a good idea about why they're worried, what do they think is going to happen, and what is it about the situation that's making them worried. So, they might say they're worried about school, and we might jump to X, Y, and Z thinking, oh, this is why they're worried, but they could be worried about something completely different. So really understanding what the worry is helps us to help them to challenge that. And then to challenge, what we're going to do is think about some of the evidence or some of the alternatives to that worry. So we can think about, has this worry happened before? Has the situation happened before? And if it hasn't, that's great, because we've got a reference point. We've got an anchor that we can look to. So with that anchor, we can think, well, what happened last time this happened? So if you've got a young person, for example, that's worried about going to a history lesson because they're not too fond of the teacher, or because they don't like talking in class, maybe, what happened last time you went? And they might say, okay, well, I was really quite worried, but when I spoke, I just said my bit and I sat down, it was okay, really. And we can use that anchor point to say, okay, well, what's going to happen this time then? What do you predict is going to happen? And why would it be different to last time? So we can start to use past experiences as evidence to help build a more balanced perspective. Another thing we can do is ask our young people, well, what would you tell your friend if they were in this situation? We know that sort of adolescents can go through a bit of a negative bias. They can sort of think a bit more negatively than perhaps adults or much younger children, just because of how the brain's developing. But we find that when we ask young people to advise their friends, they're much more compassionate and more empathetic than if they were thinking about that towards themselves. So asking our young people to think about what they'd tell their friends if they were in that situation, and then trying to apply that to themselves. Sometimes it can be helpful to ask, well, what's the worst that could happen? And this is helpful if maybe the worry is being blown a bit out of proportion. We can sort of get the worst possible thing that could happen, and to try and build a perspective that actually that's not that bad. Sometimes asking what the worst that could happen won't be helpful, and it might make that anxiety worse. So we have to use our judgment to think when that's going to be appropriate. On the flip side, we can think, well, what's the best thing that could happen from that situation? Often when we're feeling anxious and worried, we're focusing on the negatives and what's going to go wrong. But actually, there's a flip side, that things could go really right and things could be really good. And what is the best thing that could happen? So if your young person's about to take an exam, okay, so they're worried that they might not pass, they might do really badly, but actually what's the best that could happen? They could do really well, and they'd be so proud of themselves, would be proud of them, and it would be a big success. So trying to keep a balance, I suppose, not just talking positively for the sake of talking positively, but giving them an alternative outcome that brings a bit of balance to the thinking. That's what we're trying to do. And then thinking about, are there any other possible outcomes or explanations that the young person hasn't thought about? If we're worried, we can often get caught almost in tunnel vision. We think about sort of a particular outcome and we start trying to dissect it and almost trying to plan how to avoid that outcome from happening. But there might be many different possible outcomes or explanations that could happen. And just trying to get those different perspectives can be helpful as well. Sort of different to reassurance, self-assurance takes time. It's generally a longer conversation. So we've got a few tips here that I'm just going to quickly run through before I pass over to Gemma. That's really thinking about how we build this self-assurance in a way that works for both you and your young person. So it's a longer conversation than reassurance. So it's probably not the best time to do it when you've pulled up to the school gate and your young person's saying, I'm worried about going in. Sometimes reassurance might be more helpful. So I'm not saying stop doing reassurance entirely, only do self-assurance. It's going to take time to build those skills. So we have to sort of do it quite slowly, I suppose. So having a conversation that's at the right time for the both of you. So striking while our iron's cold. So not while your young person's feeling extremely anxious, or while you're feeling extremely anxious as well, you have to be in the headspace and to not have flipped your lid in order to be able to have that conversation as well. Try to focus on one worry per conversation to start with. So don't get caught up in trying to deal with 10 different worries at once. Just try and focus on one that's sort of in the moment and the biggest one at the time. Encouraging the answer from your young person. So if you're asking the questions and they're giving the answers, that's them building self-assurance. They're thinking about it, they're considering the different options, and they're giving you the answer. Once we start giving the answers for them, that's slipping back into reassurance. So we want to ask the questions to help guide them through the process, but try and really get those answers from them. The process is more important than the outcome. It's not going to be a case of once self-assurance is done once, that worry is gone, and self-assurance is going to be the only way a young person thinks moving forward. Doesn't quite work like that. It's not a magic bullet, unfortunately. So the process of actually going through, asking those questions, the young person thinking about the answers and considering the event and the situation from different perspectives is generally more important than what the final result is, because we're trying to build those skills. And lastly, trying to write down and record responses to check back on can be really helpful. So we can start thinking about, okay, what was our prediction? What do we think was going to happen? What was the worst thing that could happen? And then what actually happened? And start to try and compare those two, and to think, sort of do some of that prediction testing, a bit like a science experiment. Okay, so Gemma's just going to talk us through a bit more about self-assurance. And then we'll come to the end of part one.
Brilliant, thanks, Ellis. So on the screen, just to kind of follow on from what Ellis was talking about, we've got some kind of thoughts that your young person, hopefully will start to develop as they become more self-assured. So we've just grouped them into 3 different groups: coping statements, positive self-talk, and balancing thoughts and ideas. So just going to talk through those again. And I guess this is the kind of language that you might start to use to kind of reframe some of those thinking trap thoughts that we were talking about earlier. So looking at that switch almost in that self-talk of how your young person starts talking to themselves, because I think that's something that we all do, and it's just a really good opportunity to kind of reframe that into a more helpful kind of thought that might help them kind of tackle or challenge their anxiety. So I think coping statements is a really good place to start, because sometimes we're focusing on what we're not coping with, but actually we can flip that round and think about our previous experiences, think about something that went really well and how you did manage. And sometimes it's also about thinking about, okay, actually it didn't go great, but how did I cope in that moment? Because that's also more realistic sometimes. So getting a young person to think about, a time that they've coped before, or how they would cope, or the skills that they've got that they can use, can be really helpful to kind of reframe that. I'm not going to cope, I can't cope, thinking like, well, I've done this before and this is what I did and it was okay. And I think following that, the idea of kind of that positive self-talk, I think we've all got on our shoulders sometimes, unfortunately, that kind of inner critic, that voice that says, oh, I don't think I can do that, or I'm not going to be very good at that, or I'm really, that kind of negative self-talk that we get into. And just like Ellis said, often if we heard like a friend saying that to themselves, we'd jump in and be like, what are you talking about? We'd be so much more positive. So we want to kind of get our young people to kind of flip that round onto themselves, and kind of, I always think about turning down the volume on the inner critic. Like, we've all got it, it's okay, but how do we turn it down and kind of turn up the positive self-talk? Kind of thinking about, an example might be, if they're really your young person's worried about exams, you might say, well, I know I've worked really hard for my exams, and even if they don't go well, I've done the best that I can do. I know I've studied really hard, I know I've prepared enough. Just kind of thinking about that positive self-talk. And I think just another thing that Ellis kind of was talking about was the idea of kind of evidence, and sort of almost like an experiment. And I just want to pick up on that, because it's really important to kind of offer a balance in our thoughts or ideas. Sometimes when we're feeling really anxious, we only, we're naturally drawn to the negative, and for good reasons, as we've discussed. We're trying to keep ourselves safe. We kind of think about what's the worst that might happen. But sometimes it's really good, to go back to the evidence of like, well, what is more likely to happen? So if your young person is really worried about social situations, as some of you have said, they're thinking about maybe going out with their friends, maybe you think, well, actually, I usually have a good time when I get there, or I usually talk to this person and that helps me calm down, or I usually get distracted because we then start talking about other things. And so getting your young person to kind of think about what usually happens, or like what's the kind of evidence that maybe will help them come up with a more balanced thought. Things aren't always all good or all bad. Sometimes we just need to think about what's the middle ground, what's the more realistic middle ground. So kind of balancing your thoughts and ideas. And I think sometimes, if your young person is really struggling with this, it can be really helpful to model this yourself. Someone said earlier they feel like their young person kind of doesn't listen to what they're saying. But even if they don't seem like they're listening, they're observing you and they're taking notice, and they're noticing how you are kind of talking to yourself or treating yourself. So sometimes just modeling these strategies, just showing like, you might be thinking you've got to, someone was saying about presenting at work, you've got something coming up at work you don't want to do, but you might say, well, I've prepared for it as best I can. I'm going to do the best job I can. And just modeling that, positive self-talk can be really helpful for your young person to hear that there's an alternative way of thinking or kind of responding to those anxious thoughts. So I think that's kind of just to follow on from what Ellis was saying about self-assurance and those kind of alternative ways of thinking that you might want to start encouraging in your young person, helping them to develop. So we're coming sort of to the end of the session now. I'm just going to move on to some kind of final Slidos, really, just to kind of draw everything together, help you guys think about the session as a whole. So I just want to think, what are the kind of 2 things that you might take away from the session? Maybe they're ideas that you've heard, or conversations that you kind of might want to have, or maybe just something you've noticed or realized about yourself or your young person, something that you've kind of become aware of that you want to go away and think about. And whatever feels relevant to you, I guess, is what's important. But we just want to give you an opportunity to reflect on what you've heard and what you think might be useful, or something to focus on in between this session and the next session. So I'll just give you all a minute to kind of to think about that, and we'll see what people are kind of saying. So someone's saying, there are other people out there and they're going through the same thing as me. And I think that's so important. You are not alone. And yeah, I just can't stress enough, how many parents that we do meet, and teens as well, that are really struggling, but you're not alone. And it is a normal part of life, is experiencing anxiety and, learning the skills to cope with it and how to manage your anxiety. Those are lifelong skills that are really going to help your young person. Someone saying self-assurance and ways to help them do this. Yeah, brilliant. Just having those like words in your mind, like that switch. And avoiding avoidance is brilliant. I think that's a good catchphrase. Don't avoid it. And someone saying, I give lots of reassurance, and thinking about giving the space to self-assure might help. Yeah, just creating those moments of time where you just step back from that reassurance. And someone saying, I'm not the only one struggling to get my teen to school. You are definitely not. I can promise you of that. And you're taking a great step in kind of learning about anxiety to help your young person move forward. So that's brilliant. Someone saying reassuring and self-assuring is part of your child's anxiety. Yeah, it's just stepping back and seeing those patterns of communication that we kind of get into. And then without realizing it, yeah, we're reassuring like multiple times a day. So just kind of having that awareness. Someone else saying they're not alone, helps out there. Yeah, thinking about those support networks and who else is there to support your young person. And we've got someone saying, wait until your young person's calm and do less reassurance. And I think that wait, that just moment to let them feel what they feel and process it, and just to validate, I get that you're upset, I see it. We can sit with that for a minute. Let's just wait. Let's just let that feeling happen, and then we can move into thinking about what will be helpful, rather than just trying to reassure and move on. I think that's brilliant, and someone's picked up on that. Watching out for other types of avoidance. Yeah, it's so sneaky avoidance. It can be really hard to see. So maybe going back to some of those early questions, like what are they avoiding? How are they avoiding it? What are they not doing or doing? What are you seeing? It's really good to reflect on. And moving from reassurance to self-assurance. Got someone saying as well that the refresher about the brain house makes sense. They like the flip the lid ideas and how to calm down first. Yeah, and I think it's something that kind of, makes everything that's going on in the brain kind of make sense in that really simple way. And so I definitely encourage you to kind of go back to that with your young person as well, and just kind of, it's a really non-judgmental way to say, actually, we all do this. Our brains are designed like this. We've all got that kind of propensity to get overwhelmed by our emotions. And, that's what is going on in our bodies and our brains. So let's make sense of that. And once we understand what's happening when we're feeling anxious, often it's so much less frightening because we're aware of what's going on for our bodies and ourselves, but also for our young people to develop that self-awareness is so important. And someone's saying they're going to use some of the ideas for themselves. Like, yeah, definitely do. As Ellis said, that, these ideas are for everybody. So take whatever feels helpful to you. Okay, going to move on to the last Slido. I think it's the last Slido. Oh, sorry, there's one more. But this one, we just want you to think about, just try and pick one thing that you might try and do differently over the next couple of weeks to help with your adolescence anxiety. There's been loads of ideas thrown about. You've all said you've picked up on lots of different things, but maybe try and just take it to one thing that you think, if I just do one thing over the next 2 weeks that could be different, what would that be? Less reassurance, brilliant. Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. Someone saying that being mindful that they can be anxious too, and that's why they're reassuring. And I just really commend that honesty, because I think that's so important. We can all get caught in that anxious kind of trap. And so, yeah, having awareness of your own feelings is going to be really crucial. Someone saying they're going to encourage independent activities, brilliant. Like creating opportunities for that kind of independence to happen is going to be really helpful to your young person. Talking about anxiety before we get to it, brilliant. Yeah, pick your moment, like Ellis said, and don't be afraid to consciously do that. You're not avoiding it if you're just waiting for the right moment. That's really helpful. But also sharing what you've learned today before you get to that anxious state with your young person is going to be helpful. Being with them and offering support without reassuring. Yeah, that's going to be really, really helpful. Just validating, like sometimes just saying, I see what you're going through. I know you're upset can be so helpful. And someone's going to say that they're going to talk to their teenager about what small step they can try to reduce the avoidance. Brilliant. I think just starting the conversation is really important to take away from today. Take these ideas back to your young person, start the conversation about what you're both noticing and what you might want to be different. So I think that's a brilliant start. And yeah, small steps are steps, so it doesn't matter. And often if you start with a small step, it's so much easier to build from that, rather than getting kind of overwhelmed before you've begun. And someone else saying supporting their young person to extend their support network, which I think is lovely. Yeah, not just letting it all rest with you and with them, but thinking about what else is out there. And not just professional support, but their kind of social support for their development and things like that. Really important. So we're going to move on to the last slide now, and we just want to get some feedback, if it's okay, from you guys, to just know if this session's been helpful, if it hasn't been helpful, whatever you think, it's all fine. And if you want to kind of sit in the middle somewhere because you're not sure until you've tried things out, that's completely reasonable too. But we just want to kind of get some views about whether or not we're kind of covering the right stuff, and whether or not you think it's helpful, because all of our resources and things, we really try and build them with parents in mind, but also based on feedback from parents. So that's all really helpful for us. I'll just give a second in case there's anyone else who wants to respond, and then I'll wrap things up. Brilliant. So just to kind of finish off the part one, just to kind of let you know where we're finishing, and then to let you know where we're going as well. So this webinar is designed as part of a 2-part course. So this was part 1. And we really hope that you will attempt some of the activities we've discussed, and that we'll meet again in 2 weeks' time. And we're going to talk about further strategies and ideas that kind of build on what we've already talked about. So the plan is to kind of go away and implement some of those ideas we were just talking about, and then come back to us as a group, and we'll meet again, and we'll talk about kind of what more we could think about and how we could build on some of those ideas. And to help you do that, we're going to email out some resources which we think might be helpful for you to kind of implement some of the ideas and the strategies. So use them if it's helpful, and if it's not, then don't worry about it. But we just thought it would be nice to leave you with some kind of resources to look back on. So we'll pop those out in an email to you. And yeah, thank you very much for your time. I think that's everything we've covered today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you very much.